Okay, so now this webinar is being recorded and it will be available at www.suicideinfo.ca in a few days. All of the participants at this webinar are in listen-only mode. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat box in the bottom part of your screen. And we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of Kevin's presentation as well. In the interest of keeping this webinar short and focused on our topic at hand, we've just provided some information about both ACICR and the Center for Suicide Prevention as a slide within the presentation. Our speaker today is Kevin Hodgson. He's the Manager of Programs for Hockey Education Reaching Out Society, or Heroes Hockey. Kevin has 15 years of experience working with marginalized children and youth, and he is a facilitator of training programs for the Center for Suicide Prevention. So Kevin, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Patty. So I saw a comment that Mark Rosetta has 9 people in the room with him. Well, I feel like I've got 9 people in the room with me too. So we'll see whose room has more fun, Mark, when we're all done. Thank you very much, everybody, for signing on and participating in this webinar. One thing we're excited about with this webinar is that for anybody who's attended the previous ones, we had identified the subject areas, and with these coming 3 webinars between now and the end of the school year, we're providing information based on the feedback from people such as yourself who have attended these webinars. We even had student input into it as well. And so the next 3 webinars, including this one, are subject matters that were identified to us that they would be of interest to you guys. So we're really happy to be able to provide the information to you guys that you're looking for. So we're going to spend the next bit of time here talking about this notion of what we do. How do we talk to parents about a child at risk of suicide? So we're going to enter into this discussion under the shared assumption that we are talking in general terms about having to address with parents the fact that we have had a conversation with a child about suicide, or we're feeling like we need to have a conversation with somebody's child about suicide. Certainly there's efforts and things that we can do to initiate the conversation and advocate for positive conversation directed towards parents about the issue of suicide in general, recognizing that we are all sort of children of the generation that did not talk about suicide. And the reality is that Taboo and anybody who's participated in these ongoing webinars probably is wondering, is that like a standard slide that we have in every presentation? Because we've talked about this notion of taboo, but the reality is suicide is still the word we whisper in a sentence. And so for a lot of parents attached to the children that might potentially be at risk of suicide, they're coming from a background most likely where it's not been an open conversation. So we'll take some time in a little bit to talk about how we might be able to do some proactive stuff. But the reality is taboo influences our willingness to talk about suicide. As a parent myself, I have 14 and 10-year-old. I can tell you that for my 14 and 10-year-old, suicide would be on my list of things I hope I never have to think about. My 14-year-old is a girl, so boys also fills in on that list. But the reality is suicide is one of our greatest fears as a parent, alongside a significant illness, an early pregnancy, those sorts of things. So we have our own bias towards hoping we don't have to talk about it. Again, chances are we've been raised to not talk about it typically. Conversation about suicide with a parent of a child who's at risk or you've identified at risk, there'll be an interesting constant shifting of that power imbalance. It's quite interesting for myself. You know, my kids have student teachers and teachers that are nearly half my age, but if I go in for a conversation about my child, guess who's in control of that conversation when it starts? It's the teacher. And during the course of these conversations, I think you'll find that a power imbalance will go back and forth, because the reality is the parents are the expert, but you as the teachers identified the issue also has some key information you want to be able to share. So, and you'll see in a couple of the other points that we talk about too, there'll be some other things that will factor into this notion that authority or the power imbalance will really exist in this conversation, because we're also speaking about something that comes through the heart first, not through the head. Logic sometimes leaves parts of these discussions. We do need to, as a, on a proactive level, use opportunities to stimulate discussion between youth and adults about suicide. This can happen sometimes in really simple ways. Myself and some of my colleagues have had opportunities to participate in, novel studies in high school classrooms that are centered around a novel for young adults where suicide's the topic of the book, or we've gone and done presentations at high schools, and those trigger discussions hopefully at home between children and their parents about this issue of suicide as well. But Part of it is just trying to get the word suicide to be move from a whisper to a word that's spoken with equal volume. But the reality is in probably 98% of the opportunities that you're going to have to talk to parents about suicide, it's going to be reactive. You're going to be doing it because you've identified an issue about a particular child, their child, and we have a legal obligation to talk to the family about it. We know that, but there's also that moral piece of it as well. Any of us that are parents ourselves, you know that if somebody's identified a significant issue in your child, you would expect that that would be shared with you. So it's a conversation we have to be prepared to have. We have to know that legally we're obligated to have it, but from a moral perspective, we also want to make sure that we understand that this is a discussion we have to be prepared to have. And in that way, is it similar to the notion of how we talk to anybody about suicide? At the end of the day, we have to be prepared to have the conversation. The second fact that in some ways works to our favor, but in some ways can be a difficult thing as well, is this knowledge that if we're thinking about a child being at risk of suicide, you can bet that in the vast majority of cases, the parents are thinking about it about their child as well. And sometimes the worst thing that can happen is to have somebody else confirm for you what you think about your child. Now, that can be really great when you think your child's a genius, but it can also be tough when you feel like your child is struggling at school and then you hear that they are. So it can be very difficult for a parent to have that fear confirmed because, again, this is on our list of stuff we don't want to think about. And sometimes we don't like being right about our children. And this might be an example of that. If the parents are already thinking about it, they're coming into the discussion with you already emotionally tired. This is the thing that keeps them up at night. This is the thing that keeps them from being able to eat. This is the thing that has caused them to potentially isolate a little bit from their friends because they're worried about their child. And an emotionally tired individual, regardless of the age, has a more difficult time discussing things. One interesting thing that you might also see is that this might be a source of tension or a source of conflict within the family relationship that this child is coming from. So you may have a situation where one parent has figured out that the child's really struggling and suicide might be the issue, and another parent might be completely unwilling or unable to go there and perceive that that's an issue. So what you may have is a mom or dad who have disagreed about whether suicide's the issue. So depending which parent you get, you might have a very different conversation as well. If you're lucky enough to get the parent who has identified that this might be an issue, you might find it easier to find that same subject. Whereas if you get the parent who's on the other side of it. Now, not in every case are you going to have the parents sort of at conflict, but what you can generally assume is that both parents have come to the understanding that suicide is an issue at different timings. So you might have one parent who's understood this for a while and done some of their own research, and you might have another parent who literally has just figured this out the day before, that this is also an issue. So it can create a level of tension or a sense of not being allied in the family home, and you don't know how it's played out for the child as well, because again, parents are human beings first, and scared human beings don't always react in the ways that they would like to. And then lastly, we need to understand that when parents are functioning in that way, they don't need an expert first, they need an ally first. They need to know that the two of you are there having a discussion about the same thing. Because just as the suicidal individual has been sitting there hoping that somebody will ask them about suicide, a parent who's been thinking about their child's risk of suicide is probably hoping that somebody will identify that as well. So they really need an ally first. If you go in expert first, that you're going to tell them what's wrong, you'll probably find that your conversation is much more difficult to have. You really go in looking for that notion of what do we share in common, and what you share in common is that child and your desire that that child is going to be okay, your desire that that child can be supported, and that there's an element of hope there, because just as the suicidal youth might have lost hope, there's a little bit of that parent that you're talking to that's maybe lost hope a little bit as well. So they need that ally first, they need to feel that from you, then they need supports that are identified. And finally, they need that expertise last. At the end of the day, when this discussion ends, it's really going to be around what can we do? What's the next step? What kind of supports can we offer? And that's where you might be in the role of expert. But really, ally first, support the parent through their feelings. That might literally mean letting them cry and then getting to the point, okay, here's what we do about it. To be able to communicate with families, ultimately we need to rely on our active listening skills. If we are waiting to talk as opposed to listening to the parents, we need to make sure that we're not doing that. So if we follow this laugh scenario in terms of active listening, so listening, empathizing, and communicating respect, parents who are being informed that their child is at risk of suicide, the very first place that they go is that they've done something wrong. What have I done as a parent? Why am I not a good enough parent because this has happened to me and it doesn't happen to anybody else? Even though we know that the risk of suicide is great, in terms of, anybody can be at risk of suicide. When it's your child, you feel like it's a failure on your part. So we need to make sure that we're listening, empathizing with their feelings, and communicating respect to them in their role as the expert about their child. One of the ways we do that is by asking questions, clarifying. It's interesting because one of the roots of potential concern around a child's risk of suicide is where there's discrepancies in terms of what the parents and the school are identifying, particularly if they're seeing different behaviors. So it's important that we're asking questions about the behaviors that we've seen at school and what that looks like at home. Ask the parents to describe what they see and really get them to paint that picture. And while you're doing that, asking permission to take notes, which sometimes can seem like a challenging thing because you want to make sure you're engaged eye to eye, heart to heart in the conversation with the parent. But it's really important that we have the information in front of us. It's important that we are understanding with clarity what they're describing to us, and we don't want to stumble over our words and get things incorrect. So asking permission to take notes that then you can give the parent some control after about how we dispose of those and where they go and how they can control some of that. Focusing on the issues, which for us is going to primarily be observed behaviors. You are the objective observer, but it's going to be largely changes in behavior. The reason you're going to be concerned about suicide for a child or a youth in your classroom is there's going to be changes in behaviors that you typically have not seen that have now come up, which may lead you to believe that suicide is an issue. And if anybody's attended previous webinars or your own knowledge about the issue of suicide, we know that it's typically rooted in changes in behaviors. That's how we know something's not right. So the kid in your classroom who is normally the social butterfly, is a leader, has a strong voice, confident in themselves, all of a sudden is hiding in the corner, not talking to anybody, and really trying to just blend into the woodwork, might be a change in behavior that you've said, hey, something's wrong with Johnny, we need to do something. And then lastly, it's that finding the first step. It's taking the information that the parents have given you, combine it with what you've observed, and then determining what the course of action or what the first step is. As we've identified in previous webinars, we're not asking you to take on a clinical long-term caregiving role. So the first step is really going to be about connecting them to resources, but even that, before that, it's going to be connecting the families to hope, connecting them to the feeling that there's something that we can do about this. And the nice advantage that they have is that you are in a position where you get to see the child every day. So while you may not be the long-term caregiver, what you will be is somebody who can see the child, and just as you've seen changes in behaviors that's led you to be concerned, you might also be able to report changes in behavior that you see them going back to the child that they were before, and you see opportunities to really understand that the child is growing and moving in the right direction and the supports are working. The third fact, as a parent, it's going to be very difficult to expect them not to be defensive. You need to be very careful about how you initiate the conversation. Every time my wife says to me, we need to talk, I know that I'm in trouble. That's not when she's telling me how much she appreciates me. The good conversations start off with, sweetie, can we talk about something? So be really, really mindful about how you broach parents. And it's really interesting, as a parent, we all know the phone number of our kid's school. So when that phone number comes up on our phone in the caller ID, instantly we assume that we're going to be told something's wrong with our child, whether they're sick, there's been a behavior issue, something like that. Because generally it's understood that teachers don't call to say, your kid's really smart and had a great day, because there's little time for teachers to do that and be able to teach, because by and large, more kids have more good days than bad days. So instantly they'll be on the defensive when they're, whether you're phoning them or whether you're out on the schoolyard and the teacher waves you over. So be mindful of how you broach that conversation. And sometimes this flies in the face of how we talk about interacting with people who are at risk of suicide, because we say we need to be able to communicate really directly. And in this particular case, we need to soft sell and sort of move into it with the parents and say, I need a few minutes of your time to share some of the things that I've observed in my classroom. And I want to get a sense if you've seen some of these as well at home, and get the picture painted and find out where the similarities are and find out where the differences are. And again, honoring the parents as the experts. Our role is as the objective observer. It's not as the expert. Though you spend a large amount of time with my child, you still don't know them better than I do as a parent. Even though quite frankly, you probably know which boys my daughter's more interested than I am, it doesn't mean that you're the expert, or certainly you need to make sure that you treat the parent's role as the expert and you're the objective observer. Fourth fact to keep in mind, and we touched on this a little bit already, Parents respond with their heart, not with their head. When it's any other person's child, you can be really logical, you can be really objective, you can be really understanding about the impact of all sorts of things. But even your most high functioning parent responds to difficult discussions with their heart first. And it's because it's their child, they're scared, they're concerned about what this means for their child's future, but they're also concerned about what it means for them. And again, it goes back to that most highly functioning parent will be instantly looking for, where did I do something wrong that this is the result? Is there something I could have done differently? And the sad reality is, who else is going to find out? As human beings, we always are worried about what other people are going to think as well. So that's why you're going to get an emotional response first from a parent. You need to give them the time. You need to be patient enough, allow the discussion to move from their heart to their head. The heart by itself will never make a good decision. It will only make a good decision when it touches the brain on the way out. And this is where we need to really understand the difference between waiting to talk versus listening. A parent might need to take 12 minutes to tell you how they feel, and you need to respond to what it is that they're giving you, as opposed to waiting for them to finish so that you can say what you want to say. Parents will have a story to tell, just as their child will have a story to tell about what got them to where they're at. And finally, one thing we want to make sure that we touch on, and certainly as educators, I'm sure you have experience working with what, for lack of a better term, we've identified here as surrogate caregivers, but you will have had children in your school that are group home staff, foster parents, extended family, somebody other than the bio family, or potentially somebody other than the guardian or the parent that you're speaking to. And what you may see is a very, very different response from those surrogate caregivers as opposed to a parent. So you talk to me about my child being at risk of suicide, though I might be emotional, though I might be defensive, all those sorts of things, I will be child focused first. That will be my primary focus. I will literally be able to see my child's face in front of me, but how I respond to you is going to be influenced by my own personal experiences and my own personal attitudes about suicide. So you don't know, when you broach a conversation with a parent, whether their own parent had some issues with suicide, what the role of suicide has been in that family, that sort of thing. But their response is going to be influenced by a lot of that personal experience, that baggage that they're carrying with them. Surrogate caregivers are still going to be focused on the child, but they are going to be primarily focused on the information that's led up to you having this discussion. And their reaction is going to be influenced by external systems, because and probably the way you're going to see that is they're going to ask you for a pen and paper to write all this down, and they're going to need to repeat key facts, timelines, things that might seem relatively innocuous to you, but they're going to be focused on, what day was it that you first saw this behavior? What time was it today that you asked the child about suicide? How many times did you try calling me before you got a hold of me? Because they have external systems, whether it's the child welfare system, whatever it is, who are going to be asking all those questions. And they know that they have not only the responsibility of the child, but they also have responsibilities to other adults to go back and repeat this story to. And there will be that small element of them that's wondering about, how are my decisions and how are my behaviors going to be judged? There's a different level of perceived scrutiny for those guys. So please be patient when you're working with these surrogate caregivers. Please give them the room to do that, and please don't judge them that they are perhaps more focused on the logic and less on the emotion of the situation. But they've got a lot of people. They've got social workers who may be acting as guardians. They've got all these external systems that are sitting there waiting to ask them questions about this. And depending on the scenario, if you're talking about a child who's in a group home, chances are that their external systems dictate that once they're done with you, no matter how that conversation goes, their next stop is the hospital to get a formal assessment in a healthcare facility. So then they're sitting there, and then they've got to be able to tell the story to someone else that you've just told them. And they want to make sure they get the details absolutely correct. So you'll see that different response. Don't judge the person on the other side of it based on that, but just recognize that at the end of the day, you still have that same shared focus, which is the child. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions. I certainly have seen in the chat box, there's been some, and maybe Patty, I will turn it back to you if there's been one in particular that you've seen that you want to make sure we get a chance to respond to.
No, I just asked a question asking people to share their experiences, Kevin, actually, with having talked to parents about a suicidal child. But we do have a question here with regards to if a child's gender or sexuality is diverse and the parents are not supportive and there is a risk of suicide. And the comment goes on to say that some parents blame the gender and the sexual diversity as the cause. Do you have any suggestions or comments?
Well, I think a couple things. One is when we talk about the sexual diversity or the sexuality. I will say that our next webinar is going to be focused on GLBT children and youth, so there will be opportunity for you to get more information about that. But I think going back to sort of the root of the question, that goes back to the parents' defensiveness. This is another thing that they've either done wrong or their family's going to be judged by or whatever that is. So we need to allow that to be the reality for that parent. Where we have to make a tough decision or where we have to be decisive is if we feel like that the parent's perception or the parent's reaction is going to potentially create greater risk in that they are not going to be able to respond to their child and keep them safe. In the absolute most simple example, if we know that a child's telling us that they're going to kill themselves using their dad's gun, and for whatever reason dad says to you that he's not going to take the gun away from his kid, that puts the child at greater risk. So that's where then those thresholds that exist within your own workplace around how you make decisions about calling child welfare come into play. And of course, at the end of the day, if we think that their risk, if the parents can't provide safety for the child, we ultimately have to make that call. But I think some of the things you identify around gender. So for example, my guess is the question sort of is that girls are seen sort of as they may threaten it or they may exhibit suicide attempts or suicidal behavior more often than males, and so it might get written off saying, well, she's done it 6 times before or whatever that is. The reality is that's the parent's defensiveness, and in some ways that's the parents trying to convince themselves that everything's going to be okay. The reality is, from our end, we have a responsibility to make sure that we know we're doing everything we can to make sure that that child's okay, and we may have to push the issue a little bit with the families as well. One of the questions that was just handed to me by one of the people in the room was a question around the child begs you not to tell the parents. This is not altogether uncommon, I think, especially when you're anybody who's had a conversation with a youth about the issue of suicide. And as a general rule, children are not begging you to not tell the parents because they actually don't want you to tell them. They're trying to get some level of control over how that conversation is going to happen, and they want to be participants in the negotiation about how we make that happen. And some part of it is that they might simply want to know that you'll do it for them. They might not be in a position where they're willing to say to the child or to their parent, Mom, things are so bad. This is what's happened to me. So it could be something where they say, can I sit on the floor underneath your desk? Will you tell my parents? That wouldn't be the end of the world. The reality is that they're looking to negotiate with you that how that conversation is going to happen. You have to be really honest all the way through your whole conversation with the child that you can't not tell the parent and that you'd like to work with them to identify how. If they absolutely positively would not buy into it and that they are absolutely resistant, you need to figure out how you're going to be able to have that conversation with them not present. But certainly in many people's experiences, fellow trainers of mine and people that have been in workshops, what the experience is the child is simply trying to take some direction in negotiating how that informing is going to happen to the families.
Kevin, can you speak a little bit to, I guess, just generally the kinds of resources that might be available for teachers in terms of what the next step is after this conversation?
Yeah. So you'll just see here on this slide here, we've brought up a couple of the references in terms of where we generate some more information. The reality is that community-based resources are going to be the next step for families. So we need to make sure that, it's not necessarily the teachers or the educators' job to take them to all these sorts of things, but we need to identify with the families what resources are they familiar with in the community, and if they aren't familiar with, how are we going to get them connected to them. So that's where, things like Canadian Mental Health Association, certainly distress lines, that sort of thing. I mean, distress centers are great resources for a parent to call and say, I just had a conversation with my child's teacher about this issue of suicide. They're very concerned about my child. I am as well. Where do I go next? And so there is an added level of support that's there for them, but they'll also be able to connect them, because the reality is if this conversation's happening at the end of the school day, some of the formal sort of 8:30 to 4:30 resources may not potentially be available to them. So we want to get them connected to those community resources. If you're perceiving that the child's at a high risk, then obviously you're looking at potentially going to a hospital or something like that, and they also can potentially make some resources. But really, it's about using some of those external community-based resources that probably you as an educator and you as your school are having to connect families to, for a range of things. And as well, it's also about encouraging parents to use resources that they may already have in place. So if you have a parent, for example, whose child has already been working with a therapist, maybe it's about making sure that this conversation goes back to the therapist, but also inquiring whether the parents have access to employee assistance programs and that sort of thing. I think there's this perception that children and youth who are at risk of suicide come from low income, highly isolated families, and certainly there are some of those, but we know that anybody can be at risk of suicide. And certainly anecdotally, we've heard lots of stories about high achieving kids from families of opportunity and that sort of thing. So exploring with the families what they've got there, because employee assistance programs are designed to support not only the parent being the employee, but the families that attach to them as well. And so helping them get connected to those ones, building up those emergency ones that can get them through the night. And again, that's where things like Canadian Mental Health and your distress centers and those sorts of things are going to be your immediate resource that can provide the sense of safety for the family that night if you need to.
Great, thanks, Kevin. We've had a question too. Yes, this webinar was recorded and should be available in a few days at the Centre for Suicide Prevention's website. So that's www.suicideinfo.ca. We will send a note out to all participants just letting you know when that happens, as well as a link to a survey that we'd really appreciate your feedback on, as we need to provide that feedback to our funder and in order to build our case for some additional funding to carry on with some additional topics that you have identified. So I see there's another question here about how much of a conversation about suicide would you have with the child? How do you approach the topic with the child?
Yeah, and that in itself could be another 20-minute webinar. What I'll suggest to see that it's marked to ask that question is the first webinar we did is cached on the Center for Suicide website, Center for Suicide Prevention website, and in it there's some discussion about that. But essentially, if you're having this conversation with the parent, chances are that you have had the conversation with the child, or the next place to go might be about having that conversation with the child. If you've identified this concern in your classroom, you do want to be able to have this conversation with the child. And in lots of ways, some of that similar kind of stuff is that some of the similar approach around active listening is going to be saying, but really it's going to be identifying for the child the behaviors that you've seen in them that have caused you to be concerned about their behavior, been concerned about their well-being and how they're doing, and that it's gotten so bad that you feel like you have no other choice but to ask them a question. And that question is, are you thinking about killing yourself? And then having the discussion and letting them tell their story about why that may or may not be. I suspect teachers are okay with being told that you're wrong, because you get to hear that from kids every once in a while. So you might have a kid say, no, I'm not suicidal. And then you move on to something else. But if they say that they are, then it's really about hearing their story, understanding why that is, and then being able to integrate the parents and have that negotiation with the child about how you bring the parents into that. But you do need to be willing to ask the question as directly as you would an adult, ultimately saying, I'm so concerned about your well-being. I need to ask you a question, Johnny. Have you thought about killing yourself? It needs to be that direct. So in a very, very brief nutshell, but I would certainly encourage you to go back and take a look at that first webinar we did that'll be cached on the center's website.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Are there any other questions? I think we're just getting thank yous now. So just a reminder that if you have further questions after today, they can be directed to the Center for Suicide Prevention at their email address, which is noted on this slide. The topic for April 16th is the 5 things we wish all teachers knew about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered youth and suicide. And as we've already said, in a few days we'll post this recording on the Center for Suicide Prevention's website, and we'll send you a note. So thanks very much. Thanks, Kevin, to you and your colleagues at the Center for Suicide Prevention. And oh, we have one more question. I guess for our April, will you include 2-spirit gendered individuals?
we
so you can add that to your list.
Here with that, and we will add that to our list, yes.
Great, thanks.
Thank you,
so good night, everybody.